Aloha and welcome everyone to the Hawaii Community Foundation AO, a speaker series where Hawaii's experts respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. This series is an exclusive offer to HCF donors and supporters of the Hawaii Resilience Fund and of the Neighbor Island Strong Funds. More than 250 people will be joining us this morning. Leaders, donors, professional advisors, and partners are on a webinar statewide. So we thank you for joining us, and we're very grateful for the support you have given us. Together, we've deployed nearly $12 million and have leveraged and catalyzed those dollars to infuse another $30 million into our community over the past 6 months. As a result of that work, HCF will be administering more than $50 million in CARES Act funds in specific areas we believe we've built some capacity in as a result of the support you've given us. Jump to the next slide, please. Today, our focus is on the House Select Committee on COVID-19 and taking a much deeper dive into their journey. But before we do that, I'd like to recognize Hcf Board of Governors who are with us today. Of course, our Chairman, Peter Ho, who will be speaking with us a little later, Debbie Berger, Mary Bitterman, Judge Michael Broderick, Kalei Kadina Pua'a, Roberta Chu, Mike Irish, Paul Kosasa, Elliot Mills, Kathy Richardson, Jennifer Sabas, and Toby Tanaguchi. Mahalo for your continued service and your leadership, both at HCF and throughout our state. I'd like to thank our viewers for sending in questions in advance. We received a large number of questions, and we've used them to really structure our conversation today. We will also take questions from the audience, and so please, use your chat box, and we'll reserve some time at the end of our talk today so that we can answer any additional questions that you might have. Just a reminder, our four-phased approach to the pandemic, if we can go to the next slide, just to see where we're placing our funds, the funds that you've provided us. Again, phase one, risk reduction and readiness, about 2.9 million. Rapid relief and response, a little over 5 million. Recovery and stabilization, about 3.4 million. And again, each of those dollars were leveraged about 3 to 1. Either we were giving alongside, another donor or another organization, or we were encouraging them to give alongside us. And there's been a lot of good leverage and partnering throughout the course of this four-phased approach. Again, before I introduce our speakers, I want to expand a little bit on the format of today's presentation. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of you folks submitted questions, and they fell in kind of 3 buckets, and they're going to frame our discussion today. First, it was, a lot of questions around government's response and role, and we're going to dive deep into that, in a second. The second was kind of all things money and all things economy, the use of the CARES Act money, impact on our economy. A lot of questions about that, and I know Peter has some really strong and clear points on that. And then the last bucket was kind of our catch-all, and it was issues around strategy, issues around tactics, and we're going to try to dive into that area as well a little later on. So now to our speakers. I'm going to start with Speaker Scott Saiki. Scott currently serves as the representative, including areas of Makali, Kaheka, Kaka'ako, and downtown Honolulu. Since 2018, he's taken on the leadership role as House Speaker. And in 2019, he was also named President-elect of the National Conference of State Legislatures, a bipartisan organization serving the nation's 7,383 state lawmakers and legislative staff. Representative Saiki was born in Honolulu. He received his BA and Juris Doctorate from University of Hawaii at Manoa. In addition to being a state representative, he's also a practicing attorney. Peter Ho, a native of Honolulu. Peter joined Bank of Hawaii in 1993, was appointed president in 2008, and in 2010 added the titles of chairman and CEO. He's been a member of the bank's board since 2005. During his tenure, Bank of Hawaii has been named one of America's best banks by Forbes magazine for 11 consecutive years. Peter also serves as a director of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco for 2 consecutive terms from 2013 to 2018. Peter holds both Bachelor of Science degree and an MBA from the University of Southern California. He's also a 2008 graduate of Harvard Business School's Advanced Management Program. Peter volunteers on boards of various charitable and community organizations, including his favorite, as board chair of the Hawaii Community Foundation. I think this picture we have up is a good shot at, what these two leaders face on a weekly basis in the House COVID Committee. And so really want to appreciate and thank them for their leadership in our community, and want to turn it over to Speaker Saiki to take over the mic from here. Speaker?
Okay, thanks, Micah. Thanks for inviting us today. So I want to remind everybody that this photo was taken at our first COVID committee meeting on March 12th before the shutdown. So that's why nobody is, socially distanced here and doesn't have a mask. But since then, we have held all of our meetings via Zoom. I just wanted to also remind everyone who's on the call today that HCF has just played a pivotal role in our state. HCF, Micah, and the staff have just been tremendous. They're the go-to people, and whenever we've needed help with something, we've called them. They've helped us to coordinate funds, programs, services, as you know, and we're just really appreciative of what HCF has done for our state. So I wanted to start off with explaining our COVID initiative. Could we have the next slide? The House of Representatives created a select committee on COVID-19 in March. And this was, the purpose of this committee was basically to ask the larger community for help, because we knew that the state government could not do this alone, and that we needed to draw upon the resources, expertise, knowledge, experience of those in the private and nonprofit sectors. So the House created this select committee, and can I have the next slide? It was interesting because this committee evolved as time went on. We started off with 37 members. We now have an additional 27 members who serve on our different subcommittees. And Peter, when we started off, I asked Peter if he could be the co-chair of this committee. And I didn't really know Peter that well, but he agreed, and he's just been great. It's been great working with him on this initiative. So our committee is broken up into subcommittees, and as I mentioned, this has evolved over time. So I wanted to just summarize very briefly what our committee has done so far. So the first subcommittee that evolved was the Public Health Recovery Committee, and this was chaired by Dr. Mark Mugiishi from HMSA. And Mark saw early on the need for the state to develop a public health risk level chart that would tell us basically what level our state was at, using a color-coded system based upon the prevalence of COVID cases and balanced against the healthcare capacity in our state. So that was I think we have the next slide. I think it shows the public health matrix. This was the matrix that Mark developed, and this was done in March, and it was premised upon also the fundamentals that guide how we manage ourselves through COVID, which is screening, testing, contact tracing, and quarantine. Okay, could we reverse back to the prior slide, please? The second subcommittee that I wanted to highlight is our Housing and Homeless Subcommittee. This was chaired by James Kushiba. James pulled together about 15 people, and in a matter of 2 or 3 weeks, they developed a proposal to create a homeless assistance program, which is a program that was funded by the legislature in July. It's $100 million, and this provides rental assistance grants to individuals in need. And that program just was implemented about a month ago. The third subcommittee is the CARES Funds Subcommittee. So Lauren Mane from Kamehameha Schools chairs this committee, and she's just done a great job. She has spent so much time on this committee. The purpose of this subcommittee is to track CARES funds in Hawaii to ensure that they are being spent, and to also give particular emphasis on funds that are available to nonprofits and other community organizations. So Lauren has developed, working with Joe Takuda from the Data Collaborative, developed all kinds of Excel spreadsheets and ways to track the funds. And one of the reasons why we started this committee was because, we had heard horror stories that in the past, the federal government has provided funds to the state of Hawaii. And in some cases, these funds have just sat in the state treasury for 7, 10 years at a time without being spent. We do not want that to happen with the CARES funds. Okay, and the last subcommittee that I want to highlight is the Strategy and Communications Subcommittee. This is chaired by Ray Vera, and it's, as you can see, it's also divided up into 4 work groups. And Ray has just run with this subcommittee. And I want to just tell you what the purpose is in Ray's words. It is to bring clarity where there is confusion and not add confusion where there is clarity. So Ray has broken down his committee into these 4 areas to deal with tourism, travel, the reopening. It's a tourism reopening work group, travel communications work group. He's also worked with other private partners to create the Hawaii COVID Collaborative, which led to the creation of the COVID PAL work group. COVID PAL initiative, as well as the collaborative, are designed to be able to translate data, to do analysis, so that the public understands how we can stop COVID in Hawaii. And COVID PAL is run by Na'alehu Anthony from OEV TV, and there is a website for it. If you haven't seen it yet, you should check it out. It's covidpal.org. So that is kind of the next slide, please. And the next slide. Okay, this was this is a slide from Lauren's CARES Act work group subcommittee. This shows just an overview of some of the work that they've done to track funds. And cut the next slide. This is from COVID PAL. So this is an example of how Ray and Na'alehu are trying to translate data to make it practical for Hawaii residents to understand. And cut the next slide. Okay, so those are all of my slides. I have Peter, do you want to add anything about our COVID committee?
No, maybe, Scott, the only thing that I would add is that the committee is, I think it's a good descriptor, Micah, to talk about it being really community-wide, so business and not-for-profit as well as governmental. But even within those categories, there's an awful lot of variety. So we have the neighbor islands represented. We have a lot of the associations in addition to the local chambers, but just industry associations and the like. And it's really, for the first time, at least in my memory, the first time that we've brought together such a whole of community type of forum to attack what's obviously been a very challenging opponent in COVID-19.
This pandemic has been difficult for government. And I think it was the premise by which you stood up this committee. You got the resolution passed, Speaker, and realized that that government needed help, and you reached out and you kind of did that. But why did government have such a difficult time responding? And how did that, journey of trying to be a complement to that need, frame up how the evolution of the COVID committee evolved? Maybe you can speak a little bit to that.
Sure. And before that, I also want to acknowledge 4 of my House colleagues who also serve on our committee: Representative Della Bellotti, Bob McDermott, Richard Onishi, and Kyle Yamashita. So they've spent a lot of time as well on this committee. I think the challenge that that government faced, as everyone else did, is that this pandemic was not anticipated. And one of the challenges that we are learning more and more about with as far as the government response is that we need to improve how we operationalize our government services and our government response at a time like this. I think that we need to make lines of authority clearer. We need to provide more direction. We need to work with everyone within the state government to ensure that they are able to change the way they do their work, take on different kinds of responsibilities, be more responsive to what is needed. And I don't want to make it sound like I'm blaming state workers because I am not. The government workforce is under tremendous stress. They are working really hard. I know there are offices that are working 7 days a week, and everyone is trying their best. But I think that it's really important for government to learn how we can better operationalize ourselves at a time like this.
So, early on in this slide deck, you kind of set the table for us, speaker, and now we're already starting to dive into the three buckets that we're going to talk about. So we're touching a little bit right now on government's response and role. And Peter, you were there from day one, and you've seen the evolution of the interaction between the COVID committee that you're chairing and government's kind of, response to it. How has that been for you? I mean, normally, as a business leader, you've asked to come and testify, submit testimony. This is a much different animal. How has that been for you and some of your colleagues?
It's been different. It's been, I remember the picture that you showed earlier was from, as Scott mentioned, our first meeting. And I'm used to either being summoned to that building, and that's not such a good day, or basically, attending kind of a, perfunctory type of event. And this was something obviously quite different. So I think different is the catchphrase. And, I think Scott brings up a great point. This is not an indictment on state workers by any stretch. When you think about the magnitude of COVID-19 and its suddenness, look, we just have not geared, and we've not intended to gear state government to take on this kind of challenge. And hats off to Speaker and frankly his foresight in trying to bring together an organization like the House Select Committee, because I think it's getting at the root issues, which is how do we bring resource to this situation, to this crisis, and now increasingly kind of new normal type of environment. And I think that's been really the driving strategy, the driving element. And I think one of the challenges, and I think we've made progress, is that historically, and you've alluded to it, Micah, in our early prior discussions around this session, kind of the relationship amongst and between, the not-for-profit sector and the government sector and the business sector. I wouldn't say they've been strained, and I don't think they're negative, but these are generally three silos that operate pretty independently of themselves, in day-to-day operations, and they've had to come together to work as a cohesive unit.
Yeah, so it's somewhat of a team of rivals. Go ahead, Speaker.
I was going to say that I feel like that our committee is an example of a successful public-private partnership on an operational level. I think it's been challenging in Hawaii to establish P3s, but this committee, I think, gives us a model for interaction between the different sectors. That is something that I think could also be improved over time, because to an extent there is somewhat of a distrust between the public and private sectors, including the nonprofit sector. But I think that this gives us an opportunity to revisit that, to fix that. What's interesting is that when we created this committee in March, every single person that we called to ask to be a member said yes. And since March, people have called and asked if they could be a part of it. So I'm hoping that this gives us a model for how we can apply this kind of cooperation in other areas.
The journey of the committee, Speaker and Peter, has been kind of a trough, and there's a lot of ups and downs. I mean, early on, a lot of conversations with Department of Health on releasing data. You had to exercise some of your superpowers in subpoenaing for information. It got very testy. We're not used to having kind of a truth over harmony. We tend to want harmony over truth, and you folks were diving into that truth space. How do you speak to some of that, because it's come in cycles, right? And we're seeing another cycle of it right now with the pretest arguments, and the kind of little bit disjointedness between what's happening at the county level and the state level, and you've got accustomed to dealing with those ebbs and flows at the COVID committee. Can you talk to that a little bit and how you see that helping us going forward? Peter, you want to jump in on that a little bit first?
Yeah, well, I think that passive aggressivism is one thing that our community, for whatever reason, historically has been awfully good at and almost world class at. And I think you're right, Mike. It has gotten in the way of progress historically for us. I think one of the gifts, if you will, that the crisis and COVID-19 has brought to us is a stark reality of just an awful lot of misery throughout our community. And so, we just don't really have time not to see through to truths and realities, because people are hurting and people are suffering and people continue to suffer. And I can tell you, everyone on the committee, beginning with Speaker Saiki, wishes to make that a better situation. And I think that there's a pretty common understanding that beating around the bush and not getting to the point is not helping our community, which is what I think everyone can, to an individual on that committee is after. And I think that's been the difference. It's really that the stakes are so high that there's really no room for that kind of silliness.
Mm-hmm. Speaker, you want to touch on that?
Yeah, that was why one of the the points that our committee has really focused on is access to data, to public health data, because we know that even if the numbers may not be positive, that the public needs to understand what's happening. So one of our arguments is that if the public was more aware of where COVID is spreading and how it's spreading, then maybe the public will be a little bit more careful about how they interact on a day-to-day basis. So that was one of the reasons why we made a strong push with the health department to secure more data. I think that things have gotten better at the health department with the change in management there. The department is more responsive, it's more forthcoming, and it is developing more data protocols for the public to access.
Let's touch on kind of a current event right now, and something that I know a lot of conversation is going on within your subcommittee, specifically in the Comms and Strategy Committee that you've been actively engaged with, both Peter and Speaker Saiki, around this little bit of a disjointedness between the county's response and the state's response, and what is your guidance there? What's your thinking, and what role are you going to see the COVID committee playing, perhaps, in bringing some clarity on that issue?
Well, we'll be discussing this more fully at our next meeting on Monday. I want to say, first of all, that we, as far as counties go, we get it. We know and we understand that that residents of the different neighbor islands, like the residents on Oahu, are first and foremost concerned about health and safety on their islands. And so we totally get that, and we know that the mayors are working to ensure that for their residents. At the same time, it's really important now, especially with the October 15th reopening, that we have some statewide standards and protocols in place, not just with travel, but within other areas as well. And and that's really important, because people throughout the state and people who deal with us from outside of Hawaii need to understand what the rules are and what the protocols are. If we have inconsistent standards, as you know, there's gonna be confusion, and then there's gonna be violations, and there will be a lack of enforcement. And we don't want that to happen. The governor has the authority under his proclamation to guide and to basically manage the counties, and he needs to fully exercise that authority as governor, because we need to have statewide standards in place.
Peter, you want to chime in on that, Peter?
Sure. I think that one of the challenges to being an island state or state of islands actually is our geographic makeup, right? So we're the state of Hawaii, we're a collection of islands, and what's happened is that because each county is effectively, literally its own island, we've seen different outcomes in the virus. So, Oahu, for the most part, is taking it on the chin. Things are getting better. I give a lot of credit to Mayor Caldwell for really putting the suppression efforts in recently and bringing those numbers down. They look better. Kauai and Maui, by national standards, are really, virtually world class. And the Big Island, I think, most recently has had its challenges. So it's easy to see how communities, because they are in and of themselves surrounded by water, come to different conclusions. That's one concept. The other concept, though, is that, as time goes on and as we begin to understand health and treatment protocols and testing protocols better, I think the opportunity does exist to allow us to maintain a reasonable health posture while at the same time get our economy going again. And I think bringing those two concepts together is really important. And where we, I think, could do a better job, frankly, as leaders, capital L, in this community, is by better communication. Because when you have different circumstances, but everyone trying to get towards a common goal, it's really communication that has to come into play to get everyone, in line and onto a common strategy and vision.
I was going to wait for this topic under the kind of strategy and tactics, but I think you brought it up, Peter. I think we should tap into it right now around communication. I mean, there's, the last 2 weeks, so much of our communication has been around data points that drive the reopening of our economy. And as a result of it, it appears that that's the 800-pound gorilla that's going to drive the health and wellness of people, when in reality, as we've discussed in the committee, the biggest one is how we interface with each other. And what data points we should be looking at that are the biggest threats to a resurgence of the pandemic. Peter, stay on that for a little bit, and maybe you can speak to that, because we've had some pretty good conversation around that.
Well, I think it's important to remember that this is a situation and a topic that literally came up last January, February. So it's brand new. It's not an easy. It's a complex topic. There's a lot of fear attached to it. So communication, effective communication generally runs counter to all of those elements. So it's difficult to begin with. And then as we try to move towards a goal, I think, frankly, as a community, we probably weren't communicating as well as we should be or could be. I think we're getting better. But the reality is it's simple things that make the situation better, like hand washing, wearing a mask, social distancing. And those are, those can be taxing things to do, I understand. But, that's really the key to everything, delivering that messaging around those simple concepts that seem simple, but in the reality of our everyday lives are maybe anything but simple. And so communication is key. I don't think we've been as good as we have needed to be, but I think we're trending in the right direction.
Yeah, Speaker, you want to touch on that?
Yeah. So Ray's subcommittee has brought together over the past few weeks the communications managers from the different departments, including the governor's office, as well as some of the private vendors that have, been brought on to help with communications. And, something that I kind of realized, and had never really thought about this before, but I realized that just sitting in on their meetings is that, the communications work is really, really important, because I think what it does is, as the communications people begin to plot out what their message is and, what information they want to release, by going through that process, it exposes the gaps, and it tells you where what is missing, what we need. So I think it really helps to provide the continuum and the execution of whatever policy decisions are being made, or whatever operational decisions are being made.
So do you folks think we're paying attention to the right data points right now?
Increasingly.
We had early on, we requested data from the health department, specifically asking for the location of COVID cases, and some of the circumstances, like what kind of events or activities were occurring when COVID was contracted. And the health department was not able to provide us with that information. This request was made in, I think it was made in June, maybe in June or July. But the health department could not provide that information because I think they hadn't been collecting it through their contact tracing work over the past, the prior 4 months. So it was not available, but the health department is on track now and should be collecting that information. I think it's really important for us to understand those kinds of data points, because if the public knew where and under what circumstances COVID is, is being contracted, being spread, and the public will avoid those kinds of activities. It also helps us in the future. If there is a need for another shutdown order, we should refine it to the particular kinds of activities that are causing the spread.
Yeah, let's jump into the economy and the all things money arena a little bit. We got a lot of questions about, wanting us to take a look at the composition of our economy, the dependency we have on the tourism industry, and the highlight of the impact it has on our environment. And there's been kind of this call by many to want less that pay more, or really interested on getting your folks' thought on that. I mean, is this an opportunity for us to think about a more diversified economy, one that is more resilient to the next pandemic, or are we pretty much locked in on an economy that's going to be heavily dependent on hospitality and the military? Peter, you want to touch on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I think that those are all really important topics, but I think that there's a more pressing matter that comes, frankly, trumps that and comes a little bit ahead of that, and that is that we're experiencing just better than 12% unemployment right now, and one of the challenges that we faced even pre-COVID was that we've seen 3 consecutive years of population decline, which is unprecedented in a couple of ways. One, it's in fact unprecedented. We've never actually had 3 straight years of population decline. And secondly, that decline came in generally relatively good times. I mean, so we weren't in a recessionary environment. We find ourselves, in a recessionary environment now as a result of the pandemic. And, I think that the first order of business for us as a community is to get our economy back in order as quickly as possible. Because to the extent that we lag as a marketplace, as an economic marketplace, we will continue to bleed residents to more fertile economic markets, if you will. And that will only add additional drag to our recovery. And so I think that there is, not just a need to get the economy back and recovering, there's a real timing issue that I think dictates the sooner we can get onto that and begin recovering in tight correlation to the broader national market, the better off we're going to be, short, intermediate, even longer term economic. The diversification issue is one that we've been having for years. I think it's a reasonable, it's obviously an important discussion. It's a reasonable discussion. But to be honest with you, Mike, I'm frankly more concerned with getting things shovel ready and moving in the coming days, weeks, and months. I think that's important to us.
Mm-hmm. Speaker, you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, so I totally agree with Peter. At the outset of the pandemic, if you look at my public comments, I repeatedly said that this was a time for us to kind of reassess the future of our economy and to see how we can diversify it. But as we see now, 7 months later, we really need to kickstart it. And the bottom line is that it's going to have to be done through travel and tourism, and that's why it's just critical that the governor continue with his plan to reopen travel on October 15. We really need that for that to happen on a statewide basis. But I think that we have to also remember that we should not be over-reliant on tourism. There's a lot of room for improvement within that industry, and we need to continue the efforts to see how we can diversify, how we can, build upon the assets in Hawaii, things that work for us.
As both of you were answering this question, one of our viewers chimed in with a question. I don't think it was intended to be flippant in the way it's asked, but the point was, why would population decline be a bad thing? And there's many ways to answer that question. I think in the conversations that we've had from an economic standpoint, those are the people that can leave. That's our working force engine, that are qualified, people that can get employed in other places. But other thoughts around that question, Peter, Speaker, around, why is population decline such a bad thing?
I'll take a stab at it, and Scott, you can. I'm sure you've got some thoughts as well. Population decline in and of itself is not technically a bad thing, but the reality is that 70+% of our economy is consumption, and so population decline is a proxy for a reduction in consumption, which is not good for those who are still here. So that the kind of the textbook outcome of population decline is that it leads to lower inputs and lower outcomes for everyone else left here in the island, number one. So the question really is not so much, what population do we need, up or down or the same. It's how do we create a better environment, a better lifestyle, a better life, better livelihood, better outcomes for those that reside here. And classically, I'll tell you that generally comes with a steadily increasing population set. And when you see a decline in population, what you generally see is some form of dissatisfaction in that equation that I think's got to be tended to.
Well, you spent a lot of time, Peter, pre-COVID on highlighting some of the inequities in our community through the Alice report. And I think how does that data, I think it was 1 out of every 2 pre-COVID, and it's much higher now. I mean, how does that play into your commentary? What do you think?
So it's interesting. Exactly a year ago this month, I gave a presentation. I think you were there, Micah, to the Hawaii Executive Conference. And I had a slide that talked about the paradox of the environment that we were living in at the time a year ago, which seems like an awful long time ago and is a totally different world. But basically the slide showed, record unemployment in a good way, record home prices, record arrivals, record visitor spending, and yet 1 out of every 2 people in our community, 1 out of every 2 households in our community could not make ends meet. And 7 out of 10 households had a difficult time just maintaining reasonable liquidity and family savings. And obviously that was a problem, that still is a problem. The challenge is that's been exacerbated by COVID. And now that record unemployment is record unemployment, but not in a good way, in a bad way. And as Speaker pointed to, our visitor industry has been destroyed. So any way you feel about the visitor industry long term, I understand, but there's no change in the fact that we have a short-term issue to work ourselves through that is going to include the visitor industry by definition, I think.
Yeah. Speaker, I'd like to get your thoughts on that, but at the same time, maybe finish your commentary around, what your thinking is on the very near term. We're getting some questions coming in about, about reopening of the tourism industry. How quickly can it happen? Is it really an event or is it a process? And we'd like to see a little bit in your head around kind of near term. Then what does it look like going into the legislative session? Is what has happened over the last 6 months start to frame your thinking about some key policy issues that you're going to tee up? And then I'd like to get both your and Peter's thoughts on the long term. Peter started to touch on it about the long-term opportunities that sit there for our economy. Peter, I know you have some thoughts about that, but Speaker, why don't you touch like right now? What needs to be done like right now between now and the end of the year? And then what are we thinking about during the next legislative session? Some early thinking about that.
Yeah, so for the short term, between now and the end of the year, we need to do, and I kind of touched upon this earlier, a couple of things. One is to make sure that we spend CARES funds, because that will go directly into the community. Number two, we need to make sure that that we proceed with our October 15 travel reopening plan. As I mentioned, travel needs to be reopened on a statewide basis. So neighbor island residents should be able to fly to travel freely as well throughout the state. I think that it's just going to be really important for the governor to stick to that October 15th date. We know, and the public needs to be aware that there will be glitches along the way as we implement the protocols. But after a few weeks or so, the government, the governor and the mayors need to sit down and analyze the data to see what kind of adjustments need to be made with the travel protocols. But we need to reopen in the short term. And as far as the legislative session goes, we will be reconvening on the third Wednesday in January. So obviously the top concern will be state finances, the state budget, as well as economic conditions. We are anticipating a shortfall of about $1.5 billion out of our $8 billion state general fund budget, which is the state taxpayer funded portion of the budget. So we need to start planning for that now.
You see any structural recommendations to government as it relates to your lessons learned on the pandemic? Some early thinking there.
Yeah, we need to understand how we can be better prepared. And I'm not sure if that would require creating a division within government that deals with pandemics and disaster response, so they can be specialized and focused. Sometimes creating another layer is the worst thing that we can do, but there has to be a way to be focused, so that we can be focused and deal with these kinds of crises as they arise in the future.
Yeah. Peter, just to kind of top off this question around kind of the long-term upside for Hawaii, you've spoken eloquently about your thoughts about where the future for Hawaii really stands, where that opportunity really stands, and what is that, and how do we position ourselves to take advantage of it?
Yeah. So I do think that there are challenges to our current economic drivers. Not that I think disparagingly about them, because they've been wonderful sources of value for us. But the defense sector is, we are squarely, well, by definition, we're number 2 in the country in terms of defense spend as a percentage of GDP. second only to Virginia. So that's good news. The not so good news is there's not a lot of room for growth there. And then on the visitor side, you know, I do think that we do need to think about the growth in that sector. If you go back to 1975, the visitor arrivals to the resident population was a ratio of 3.2 times. And you fast forward to 2019, and that ratio has grown to 7.3 times. So obviously, you can see that there's been some crowding out there. And you know, I don't view that as negative, but I would observe that there's likely limited potential further upside to the visitor industry. So we need to think through to other forms of revenue for our community. And there I think there's a lot going for us. I mean, you know, we are, by virtue of just where we happen to be, in probably the most fertile spot on Earth for the next generation, if not the next century, from a geopolitical standpoint, from an economic standpoint. I mean, this is, you know, the Indo-Pacific region is where it's going to happen. We also happen to be an incredibly beautiful place and an incredibly culturally rich place and an inclusive and friendly place to be, and multicultural. And I think when you take those two elements together, there's obviously opportunity. And I guess I struggle to see how we can't figure something out, given that our population set at 1.4 million is not a lot of people. I mean, if we were a city, we would fit somewhere between San Antonio and San Diego, size-wise. So I think from a per cap standpoint, there are a lot of assets that exist there. I think one of the interesting things to think about is how do we organize ourselves as a community, and maybe how we've managed this pandemic is a potential lesson in how to do that, and think through to what we're good at and what we can offer the world moving forward.
Hey, Michael, can we go to slide 12? I wanted to just, if I could follow up on something that Peter said, since Peter mentioned.
Joanne, can you get us to slide 12?
The Indo-Pacific.
Put that up on this.
I'll just be real fast. So when I became speaker, slide 12.
Go ahead, speaker.
When I became speaker, I went on a tour of PACOM, the Pacific Command at Camp Smith, and I didn't even know what PACOM was at that time. This is about 4 years ago. I had no idea what that was, and then I learned that PACOM is responsible for overseeing the four military branches within the Pacific Basin, and the headquarters is here. It's at Camp Smith, the PACOM headquarters, and you know, this Pacific Basin is home to 50% of the world population. There are 36 nations within this within the basin, and Hawaii is right at the center of all of this. And I think, you know, that was probably due to a lot of work that Senator Inouye did over the years to bring this to Hawaii. But I think I just wanted to mention this because, you know, sometimes I think we have to just think big. Hawaii needs to think big. Sometimes we're a little bit too provincial. But when you look at this, you know, we are in the center of all of this within the Pacific Basin. And what kind of opportunities do we have based upon this slide right here? What can we envision for ourselves? I think we need to really explore this going forward.
You know, I don't know how relevant this question might be to it, but you know, there's been a lot of conversation about the deficiencies in our digital platform to be able to capture, you know, that neural net of economic activity that can flow through that. And COVID highlighted, you know, some of that from a social context where, you know, there's a digital inequity right now. When the DOE went to a virtual platform, you know, it highlighted where the digital inequity was in some of those low-income rural communities. Is there an opportunity, Peter? I mean, how much is that important? I mean, if we could treat that digital platform like we do roads, water, sewer, and public facilities, perhaps we could capitalize on that and at the same time have a social benefit.
Yeah.
Is that climbing up to the wrong tree, or is there?
I don't think so. I think that's spot on. I think that if we were in the 20th century economy, there's not a lot for Hawaii. I mean, that was a manufacturing-led century, economically speaking. The 21st century is all about knowledge. It's all about technology. It's digital, as you say, and that creates situations where, by virtue of the tools available to you, as well as by virtue of the types of people that you're looking for, the types of assets, namely smart people that you're looking for, Hawaii actually can play quite nicely into that. And so, as Scott points out, we're in the most strategic place in the world. We do have the wind at our back to a certain extent, given the nature of commerce today. The nature of commerce today is technology. It's digitization. It doesn't rely on huge manufacturing plants for prosperity. It relies on smart people doing what they like to do, being creative to create value. And I think Hawaii could play into that. I think some of the things that are required to do that we should be thinking about. One is you need people that are talented to stick around. So I think housing affordability is a big issue for us. Secondly, education obviously is key. And so particularly in STEM, but in education in general, we really, I think as a community, need to double down, not just at the university level, which I think is underappreciated, but also at the secondary school level where, we all understand that we've got some work to do there.
Mm-hmm. Speaker, your thoughts?
Yeah, so Hawaii, is no different than other jurisdictions that have digital divide issues. So I wanted to highlight something that the DOE gave to us. They did a survey of their students to prepare for virtual learning, and it showed that for device ownership, and this is on geographic because it shows that the percentage of ownership ranges from between 55 to 90%, depending on where you live. And for connectivity, that the range is between 69 and 81% connectivity. And this is just based on a survey that the DOE did. It wasn't a scientific survey and it wasn't a complete survey, but it just shows you where the discrepancies are. And as we know, it's based upon where you live. It's based upon geography.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions I want to start, we have a few more minutes. I want to be able to tap into some of the questions. I've been trying to scan some of them and blend them into our talk, but there's one that I know you think about a lot, Speaker, and we've had some conversations about it. And you talk about thinking big, and there's been some opportunities for us to think big, but we haven't been able to get over that threshold. We've lost some pretty big opportunities, and you've spoken to both the NIMBYism of some things as well as some long-standing historic, host culture issues. You want to touch on that? I know you see that as an issue we need to address, just at a high level.
So I do not feel that it's government's role to identify and target growth industries. I think that it's more important for government to provide stable infrastructure so that so that industries or businesses can develop and thrive here, and whether that's through consistent laws or policies or things like having digital infrastructure in place. I think that is the role of government. One of the areas that we really need to address, and it's easier said than done, is how to reconcile cultural and environmental disputes that arise in Hawaii. It seems that whenever there's been, there are initiatives in Hawaii, that inevitably there will be a challenge, there'll be a lawsuit, and then plans will be suspended. I think it's really important for us to think about how we can begin to try to reconcile these kinds of issues. And as I said, it's easier said than done. And I don't want people to think that, I understand what it's like to be you know, on the short end of some of these disputes. But I think it's important for us in terms of providing stability that we try to address this.
Yeah. You know, there's been a lot of questions going back to the digital IT infrastructure, you know, around are we making the right investments there? Or is the digital divide something we can in fact do? I know the legislature appropriated quite a bit of money to start transforming Hawaii's government platform to being one that's more 21st century. What kind of progress has been made there, Speaker? And is that something we still need to focus on?
Yeah, we absolutely have to focus on that. I think one of the frustrations has been that over the past, even prior to Governor Ige's administration, you know, there was an attempt to kind of retool at least state government, the platform at state government, and I think there's resistance from within to change systems. But yeah, we definitely need to improve on this area.
We're gonna do one or two more questions, and this question actually came in earlier, and I couldn't really put it in any bucket, but I thought it was pretty provocative in that this person said there's been a lot of conversation about the economic impacts of COVID, but very little about the social and health impacts. Do you have a sense of the state of the union as a result of COVID in that space? And I know, Peter, you've been thinking a lot about that. You've been bringing that to the committee's attention in the prep meetings that we have. What's your thinking around that, Peter? The impacts that it's had on our social and health fabric of our community.
Yeah, it's all encompassing, Micah, and so one of the insidious issues with COVID is that while it may be indiscriminate, it impacts certain groups more than others, and unfortunately impacts those with less more than others. So, you know, here we see within our Pacific Islander population and other minority populations the impact greater than in some of our other areas, and that's something for us not only to think about but to respond to. I think in terms of, you know, you're absolutely right. This is not just an economic issue, although it's a mightily economic issue. But I think that there are likely fissures in mental health going on that are probably underreported or unreported that we really need to get our arms around. I mean, having people basically shut down for the better part of a year cannot be healthy for anybody. And then I think that there are issues as it relates to just general health. And, you know, I don't think that, you know, obviously COVID is an unhealthy situation, but just the fact that it's placed such a burden on the system, I think is going to create an additional derivative, if you will, of additional health needs that are going to have to be addressed down the path.
So since you got the mic, Peter, I'm going to give you just maybe 15 seconds to your parting comments. Want to thank you for being here, but what's your last 15 seconds? And I'm going to turn it over to Speaker for his parting comments.
Well, you know, thanks, Micah. First of all, thank you for having me on the event today. I've just found, you know, there have been few bright spots to this crisis. I will tell you that being able to be a member and being invited by Speaker Saiki to be part of, you know, what I think has been a successful public-private endeavor, I think has been useful for our environment, and I hope is somewhat of a roadmap for a lot of the challenges we have moving forward. So aloha, and I hope everyone has a great weekend. Thank you.
Aloha, Peter. Speaker?
Yes, thanks again for inviting us. I just hope that everybody realizes that this, you know, that this shows us how we can all be involved and how to move our state forward. And I would just want to leave with 3 questions, which is, how does Hawaii be more resilient? How do we improve problem solving and operationalizing Hawaii? And how do we build trust between the different sectors in our state? I think those are key questions for our future.
Well, we'll end on that note. I want to thank you guys. I have a unique lens in seeing all the time and work that you both are putting into trying to help Hawaii get through this. And can't thank you folks enough on behalf of Hawaii for your energy, your thought, the willingness to have the courage to step out and have candid conversations. So we thank you for that. On behalf of the Hawaii Community Foundation, our board, our chairman, Peter Ho, want to thank our staff. Appreciate you folks supporting HCF, you supporting the Hawaii Resilience Fund. We are optimistic about our future. Keep your eyes open for the November AO series invite. We're in the process of putting together a really good presentation, but we'll keep that under wraps until that invite goes out. You all have a great weekend. I want to thank everybody for their support. Aloha and mahalo.